There's a road in my town, and nobody knows where it goes. Every town has a legend. A haunted house, an abandoned mill, an apparition that appears by a bridge. Myths and legends are symbiotic with the Midwest, and every town I've lived in had one or two peculiar locations that leave you scratching your head. Usually, these stories seem to spawn as an effect of another reason. In the case of the town I lived in Colorado, the tales of a haunted grain factory seemed like an attempt to keep a relic of the town's history relevant. Then, when I moved to Utah, the story of a Main Street wraith probably spawned as a talking point in a sparsely populated town because, well, to be honest, there isn't much of anything interesting going on in the Utah desert. Then, I moved to the middle of an Arizona desert and learned of the local town's weird legend. It started 4 years ago. A man by the name of Jeffrey Willard came home late one day after delivering parcels, grabbed a hammer from his shed, and mercilessly beat his wife and dog to death. Nobody in town knows why. When the police found him, he was sitting on his porch peacefully. He didn't even know what happened. Yet, when they went inside, they were horrified at what they saw. Supposedly, Jeff was emotionless, telling the police he didn't remember anything about the night or why he did what he did. It didn't take long for the coroner to piece together what had happened. The evidence was clear. Willard was a murderer. A local friend of mine by the name of Dwayne Ulis, who was the responding officer that night, refuses to talk about his experiences that evening. While I was moving in, Dwayne helped me and my wife get acquainted with the town, and as a result, we've become good friends. We've talked a lot about each other's lives, my own experience in the police force, and I learned a lot about him from his stories, both funny and mundane. One evening, he briefly mentioned the Willard murder, and I asked him to tell me more about it. He outright refused. I understand why, too. If you've never lived in a small community, it's hard to know how a violent crime can change things. He did make one brief note, however, which was this. Jeffrey Willard was a standout man who loved his wife and loved God. He never would have done something so heinous unless something had caused him to go mad. Despite Uli's refusal to recount his story, it didn't take long to fill in more gaps, as it was a common talking point in the local bar, even 4 years later. Everything anyone's ever said was that he was a normal man living a normal life, and the morning of the murder nothing was out of the ordinary. He went to work, seemed peaceful and amiable, and appeared normal until he wasn't seen until after the murder. There was no sensible rationalization for why he did what he did. The only one who had any sort of insight was the local barkeep, Tom Davis, who recounted his experience the night of the murder to me many times. For his story, he was closing the bar when he saw Willard's headlights coming in from the desert from the west. As he says, I already knew something strange was going on when I saw someone coming down Reverie Road during the night. Willard drove by the bar, and as Tom says, it was like he was entranced. He was driving slowly, ignoring stop signs and traffic lines. As he drove by, Davis says that he got a glimpse of Willard's face. To this day, Davis insists that there was no life in the man's eyes as he drove by. That brings me to the subject of my town's local oddity. Reverie Road. On the west side of town, there is a road that begins between the gas station and the bar. It starts by the gas station and goes straight into the desert. Nobody has any idea where it goes. There are no houses in the direction it heads off to, there are no towns. There are no lakes, no mines, no rivers. There are no hotels, schools, gas stations, telephone lines, windmill farms, power plants, landfills, cattle ranches. The road does not have a highway marker, it does not even have marks in the pavement. Reverie Road is an enigma. The road does not go anywhere, but has been here even before the town. Well, why not drive down it and see where it goes? I've asked. Everyone in the community has their own story about how they tried. Yet, every attempt ended in failure. As it turns out, if you decide to turn onto Reverie Road, you will find yourself at an embankment after about 3 miles. There is a bridge that crosses this embankment, but it has fallen apart. When this was, nobody has any idea. However, crossing this trench is impossible with a motor vehicle, so nobody has been able to see where exactly the road ends. You can probably see how the murder and road's peculiar nature muddled together to form a local legend. People began to speculate. What was Willard doing on that road that night? What caused him to have an episode of extreme violence? Was it possible that something on the road provoked Willard to kill his family? Theories began to abound. One week, Reverie Road led to an ancient burial ground. Next week, the road was inhabited by skinwalkers. Some think that maybe there's a government mind-bending facility, or even Area 51. Maybe Willard had an encounter with aliens. Maybe at the end of the road, there's a cult of cannibal hillbillies, or a chemical plant that produces a toxin that turns the rabbits gay. More logical conclusions abound certainly, but even those hardly make any sense. The local area has no natural resources to mine for, and there never were plans on having a town in that direction, considering it was off the path of an already established highway. There are no bodies of water, and the land is not arable. There is no consensus on where this road goes, and hardly any history on its construction. The only thing that is certain is that if you stand on the edge of the dilapidated bridge, Reverie Road continues on indefinitely into the desert to a destination that is impossible to know. A few curious adventurers have tried to find out where the road goes. However, the Arizona desert is harsh, and is established you can't drive past the embankment. So after months of speculation, and a little bit of exploration, an urban myth was born. There's a mysterious road in the desert, and a man drove down it and came back and killed his wife and dog. Insert your own reason why. Eventually, time eroded the myth, and people began to forget about Reverie Road again. The story of Willard's violent act silently became a bruise in the town's history. Life began to return to normal, and only fragments of the original fascination with this street remained. There were still believers, but for the most part nobody cared to speculate further. Reverie Road was just a road. That was until yesterday morning. There is no way to cut to this. I was minding my business, filling my car up at the gas station. It was a typical Monday morning. My wife was chilling in the passenger seat when she suddenly tapped on the window and pointed out into the desert. I turned towards the road and quickly saw a shape moving towards the town. I watched as it drew nearer, and eventually those that were nearby stopped what they were doing to see this mysterious figure emerging from the desert. Soon, the shape came into focus as it got closer. It was a man limping, and he was dragging something behind him. As it got closer, I could hear my wife scream from inside the car, and my heart dropped. It was Tom Davis, the barkeep. He was shambling up Reverie Road, a chain wrapped around his torso as he walked laboriously towards us. Behind him, something heavy dragged on the pavement, streaking it red. I ran up to him, the small crowd of people coming with me. I called out Tom's name, but he did not respond, instead continuing to move forward. Then, when we were no farther out than a few meters, I stopped, and I could feel my body freeze. Tom Davis was dragging his dead son behind him. The crowd stopped moving. In the Arizona heat I could feel goosebumps form. I stood awestruck as I watched the details slowly emerge. Tom's torso was bloodied, and his clothes were ripped, exposing deep wounds. The chain that surrounded him was the same chain he usually had in the back of his truck, the one he volunteered to people when they needed to tow something. It was tightly wrapped around his son's neck, the teen's blue face squeezed violently as his eyes were nearly popped out of their sockets. Further, it was evident that the teen's arms had been broken in numerous places as bones protruded from his skin. Tom's face was blank, despite the oppressive sunburn he had acquired. His lips were dry and peeling. As he got closer to the intersection, his face began to show more signs of lucidity, before finally erupting into a confuddling blabber as he stepped off the road. Someone ran inside the gas station, grabbing a bottle of water. People surrounded Tom, and screams filled the still air as people began to see the condition of his son. Then, slowly, Tom turned around and let out a shriveled scream as he saw what he was dragging. I told my wife to drive home, and the police were immediately called. People started moving away from Tom, watching in silent horror as it appeared he regained consciousness. He dropped to the pavement, crying into the air, and screaming louder than any man I had ever heard scream. I watched a father hastily try to remove the chains off his dead son. I watched a father try to administer CPR. I watched a father endlessly call out his son's name, and I finally watched a father hold his son's corpse, as his wails were not returned. I could only stand with a stiff hand covering my mouth, keeping my distance from the scene as I had realized what I was witnessing. Sirens blared from the distance, and in no time, Officer Uli stepped out of his cruiser, placed his hat to his chest, and covered his mouth in horror. The officer stood there, shaking, unable to move. I watched his knees wobble before he turned around to the cruiser, nearly falling against the door. After a few minutes of abject panicking, he calmed himself before approaching Tom slowly. Tom Davis was apprehended. The body was examined by the responding officers. Nobody had a question about what happened. It appeared that Tom Davis beat and choked his son to death. And within the hour, the legend of Reverie Road returned. After Tom was apprehended, Officer Ulis organized a search party to find their vehicle and Tom's wife, as well as any supporting evidence about what might have happened. I volunteered, as did many of the townspeople, to help. Businesses closed as the community gathered at the edge of the road to help in the search. People began to speak as we began to walk into the desert. This was just like the Willard murder. The road turned him mad too. Why would he do this? The most common question churning through everyone's mind was, why? So we walked down Reverie Road in a line to find out. We combed the desert for tracks or any sort of clues as to what went on. We found no tire tracks or other evidence that Tom's truck went off path. We found no footprints, no clothing, no weapons. No sign of a struggle. The search was beginning to appear fruitless. Then, we made it to the dilapidated bridge. The bridge was still broken apart in the middle as anyone would come to expect, but something caught us by surprise. Tom's truck was on the other side of the trench. There was no evidence he drove into the trench. The ground and dry brush was undisturbed. Instead, it appeared as if he somehow drove over the bridge. Weirder yet, the white Ford was still running, as if it had been suddenly abandoned. One of the tires was flat with a knife sticking out of it, as if sabotaged. The ground surrounding the vehicle was disturbed, and blood painted the windows and hood. I heard a woman from beside me sputter out, pointing at the side of the car. Oh my God. I looked to see what she was pointing at, and I quickly pulled her away as I covered her eyes. There was a hand dangling from inside the car, blood dripping down the arm. Officer Ulis called in that they found Tom's wife shortly after. Then, without pause, I saw him turn to us, terror in his eyes and his mouth shaking. He told us we should turn around and that the search was concluded. On the way back, nobody spoke to each other. Last night, I went to go drink. I think after everything I had seen, I needed it. There were more people at the bar than usual. Good for them. There was a heavy air as one of Tom's friends was managing for the night, but he acted solemnly and talked very little, only servicing people's requests. Surprisingly, Uli showed up as well. He was still in uniform and sat in the corner without talking to much of anyone. After an hour of talking with some of the other locals, I decided to check up on him to make sure he was all right. He saw me approach, nodded, and stared out the window at the road that goes into the desert. I sat down, prying my eyes to see what he was looking at. Eventually, I spoke. "You all right?" He stiffened up, laid back in his chair, and nodded. "Yeah." He paused. "Yeah." I ordered a drink for both of us, and I brought the topic to the Cardinals and their current season. Uli seemed mildly interested, but the conversation didn't go anywhere. I was preparing to leave, to give him some time, but then, Uli surprised me. The night of the Willard murder, he sighed, gathering his thoughts, then continued. "Well, you know I don't like talking about that night." "You don't have to," I assured him. "No, I think I do." At that moment I saw a level of conviction on his face, and determination to power through what reservations he had about the topic. "I need to tell someone." "Well, I'm all ears." The night that we found Willard's wife, I remember distinctly how horrific and brutally merciless the crime scene was. I mean, Christ, one morning you've got this man and his loving wife, and by the next she was barely recognizable. Nobody had any idea what could cause a man to. He choked for a bit before continuing. And so I asked around the town about the local gossip to see if I could piece together an affair or a motive. There was none. And Willard himself was as confused as we were. But then, Tom told me about the night he saw Willard return from the desert on Reverie Road, and Ulis began to hold his hands tight to his mouth. A look of anguish splashed against his now reddening complexion. I drove down it. I paused, waiting for him to continue. What did you see? His eyes looked at me, and spoke straight and without hesitation. Nothing. There is nothing down that road. You understand? I nodded. I understand. He turned over his shoulder, at the crowd on the other side of the bar, who were oblivious to the conversation. He glanced back at me, bringing his face close to the center of the table before whispering, "What I tell you next stays with us, you hear?" I nodded again. When I came back from the road that night, I began to have nightmares. I could feel the sweat in my palms and the anxiety in my limbs. In the entire time I've known Ulis, I had never known him to be anything but level-headed. I was beginning to believe that the trauma of the morning had caused something inside him to finally come out, a side that I've never seen. Nightmares, about. I had nightmares that I drove past the bridge. I took a drink from my glass, not sure what to say. At first hearing, it didn't seem strange that he dreamed about the road after filling his mind with thoughts. But there was one word that stuck out to me. He said nightmares. What was on the other side? I don't remember, I never remember, but I could see tears forming in his eyes. I dreamed I was Willard that night, that I was the one with the hammer, and I was the one who. He paused, recollecting himself once more. I dreamed that I did what Willard did. I placed my hand on his wrist. You had a nightmare after a traumatic event, there's nothing abnormal about that. No, he said. No, it wasn't just a normal dream, he said. It was, I said. You shouldn't feel guilty about what happened, it's not anyone's fault, but Willard's. I had another one last night. And it wasn't about Willard. I froze. You're not saying. I am? He said, nodding slowly. Tom? I saw it all. I was Tom Davis in my dream. I saw the man and his family take a turn on the road. I saw him drive through the dark desert. I saw him approach the bridge and he gulped. When he was on the other side, I saw what weapon he used on the son. I saw what he did to the wife. My mouth was agape. I didn't know what to say. Ulis was letting tears stream down his face at this point, and I sat silently. You didn't see the wife's body, he continued. But I did, and it was exactly as Tom left it, weapon and all. Another long pause. Then, he started yelling through his tears. How can someone do those things to another person? People in the bar stopped talking, turning their head in our direction. I could have stopped him, I saw it coming, damn it. Christ, I could have stopped it from happening. I wanted to try and calm him down, try and tell him there was nothing he could have done. Instead, I sat silently, taking in everything that I heard. The conversation turned back to other things, and I tried my best to keep his mind off of whatever was eating at him. We only hung around for another hour before finally the bar closed, and I wished him a farewell. He bid me an adieu, a faint optimism that maybe everything was going to be fine. I knew deep down that he wasn't going to sleep that night. So I got to my car and began driving out of the bar lot. Not long after, I made it to the stoplight at the intersection with Reverie Road. The air was warm and still, and as I waited for the light to turn green, my eyes went to the dark road that drifted into the vast desert. The streetlights illuminated the entrance, but that was it. Reverie Road was shrouded in black. I turned my gaze back to the street ahead of me, staring at the main street ahead, continuing my wait as the light was still red. Then, like a magnet, my eyes went back towards the Reverie Road, its draw overpowering, and the allure indisputable. I began to wonder how much could it hurt to go down this road real quick, to see if I could find something myself. It was pulling my focus, and all I could wonder what was down there. Nothing. That's what Ulis had said. There is nothing down that road, you understand. There was something. I could already feel it. The road was sucking me in. The car honked behind me, and I looked back up to the traffic light. It was green. Without hesitation, I put my turn signal on, turned up my headlights, and turned onto Reverie Road. I drove into the desert, carefully and slowly. I had my brights on, the wheels of my car dipping and rising with the imperfect asphalt. The stars above me were faint, and the desert around me was infinite. The darkness of night was swallowing me whole as I drove deeper. All the while, I kept thinking to myself, there's nothing down this road. This is stupid. I should turn back. I was 2 miles in. There was no turning back. The loneliness was unmistakable. It felt like I was the only living thing for hundreds of miles, and even the light of the town behind me was fleeting. I turned the radio up for some company, but it eventually faded to static. It was strange, but I knew there were cold spots that the local radio tower didn't reach. Then, I made it 3 miles in. I slammed on my brakes. I heard the tires under the car screech, and I was kicked forward in my seat. My headlights illuminated the sight before me, and I could feel my breathing become labored. I sat motionless, and I must have been wide-eyed as a deer caught in the headlights. I began to shake, and I knew that something was wrong. The bridge before me was intact. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel. Impossible. With my car still running, I stepped out of the driver's side, placing my foot on the asphalt underneath. Without removing my gaze, I eyed the bridge before me. Tom's truck was still on the other side, abandoned and lifeless, still covered in blood. I stepped forward to the edge of the bridge. The road continued into an abyss of darkness stretched out before me and the headlights. I began to feel a breeze pulling me in. It would be so easy to step forward, to traverse the bridge, and make it to the other side. I could finally find out where the road went. I stood, continuing to stare into the darkness, when I saw 2 lights come on far ahead. They were like 2 pinpoints, miles down the road. They weren't moving. They looked almost like headlights, but I already knew there was nobody on the road. Another thought popped in my mind. They almost looked like eyes. The curiosity was too great. I had only goal to cross the bridge and walk into the desert. I had no other drive, no other motivation. I was going to know where it ended, and I was going to know tonight. As I stood before the bridge, placing my foot forward, it was almost like I began to dream. I dreamed about walking down the road. I dreamed that I made it to the end. I dreamed about crossing the bridge once more, making it back to town. I dreamed that I went to my garage. I grabbed a drill. I dreamed that I opened the door to my bedroom and flicked the lights on as I gripped the drill tightly, the bit spinning loudly as I stepped forward. I dreamed that my wife turned to me, fear washing over her face, and she screamed. I dreamed. No. I woke up panting. The sound of a drill ringing in my ears as I flailed around in the darkness of the desert. My eyes quickly adjusted back to the landscape around me, and I was back in the real world, standing on the bridge. The car was still running behind me. Sweat dripped down my face, and I was shaking as I crawled back to my car, put it into reverse, turned it around, and drove as fast as I could back to town. I have no idea how long I was out there for. The sun was beginning to come up over the horizon. I was shaking the entire drive back, and I soaked the seat and steering wheel in sweat. I made it home. I nearly had a heart attack before opening my bedroom, not sure what to expect. When my wife woke up, I told her I fell asleep in the bar parking lot. She was disappointed, but I could live with that. I couldn't tell her what I saw. I couldn't tell her that I was almost pulled into the other side of the bridge. She wouldn't understand. I've been shaking all morning. I can't sleep. I called into work just to write this because I need to tell someone what happened. I promise you, I'm never going back near that fucking road. I can still feel its presence. It still pulls me to it. I still have to know what's at the end. But I'm fighting against it. I'm terrified of what happens if I make that cross. I know when I go to sleep, I'll find myself there again, but I have to fight it. I've cursed myself with an endless battle. So now, I'm trying to remind myself that there's nothing down that road. It doesn't go anywhere. There is nothing at the end. Every town has a legend. In the case of Reverie Road, I'd rather keep it as that, just a legend. Monster I carried out of the woods. I found a monster in the woods. Every year I spend a week in the woods alone. I cannot stand being inside my empty house on the anniversary of when I lost everything important in my life. The walls close in on me, and I feel suffocated. So, I go to the woods. I sleep, drink, and try to shoot at least one deer. On the second day of my trip, I was walking through the forest in damp weather feeling miserable, when I came across it. A creature hanging by its foot from a tree. I panicked when I first saw the figure strung up in the tree and rushed forward, hoping if it was a person I could still help. As I got closer, I saw that even though its body was similar to a human, all the proportions looked wrong. The legs far too long and skinny. The stomach sunken in, ribcage visible making it seem like it had no muscle mass or fat. I stopped below the creature, staring up at it in disbelief of what I was seeing. One foot was stuck inside a bear trap that was attached to a chain, hooked over a branch. Its entire body was hanging from a torn and bloody ankle snared inside the trap. Wrists tied together and arms so long they nearly reached the ground as they dangled past its head. The creature's face was covered by a blank wooden oval with moss spilling out from it. At first, I was certain it was dead. As I got closer, I saw the chest rise weakly, as if let out small wheezing breaths from under the mask. Even without seeing what was under the mask, I knew this thing wasn't human. The woods had a bad reputation of people going missing. Most didn't like camping overnight inside the forest anymore. It was a good place to fish and hunt, but not to stay the night. I had my hunting rifle with me. I could put it out of its misery. Or just left it alone. Someone put this thing here. They might be back for it. Misty rain came down, and I could see puff of my breath in the terrible weather. My feet cold and fingers stiff. It would get dark in a few hours. I should go back to my camp and get dry, or else I would get sick. Or leave this damned forest before any more of these creatures came for me. Instead, I did something only an insane person would. I placed my gear on the ground to climb the tree to get the creature down. It was the middle of the night when the creature stirred. I'd treated the wounds the best I could. Getting the bear trap off without cutting my hand took almost an hour to do. Dragging the lanky thing back to camp wore me out, and I still needed to dry the creature off and wrap up its wounds. The damn thing better appreciate what I did for it. While I waited for it to wake up, I sat by the fire, sitting under a tarp to keep dry. I let the monster I dragged back use my tent, keeping the flap open so I could keep an eye on it. I was dead tired, but didn't want to fall asleep with whatever the thing was close by to eat me in my sleep. Its limbs were so long I had to fold them to make sure it fit inside my small tent. At some point in the middle of the night I heard movement in my tent. Slowly a hand came out, long fingers testing the damp ground. I couldn't see the thing's expression because of the mask and moss covering its entire head. Even while it slept, I didn't dare look what it really looked like. I remained still, wrapped up in my spare blanket. If it attacked, I could shoot it, but I didn't even reach for my rifle. Half of the creature's body came out of the tent, body freezing up when it sensed me nearby. The next few seconds were tense. Neither of us moved, waiting for the other to act first. I'd hoped this would be a treat and release process. That when this creature woke up, it would just go back off into the woods. I was not so lucky. It made the choice to attack the easy target. Darting forward, it cleared the distance between us quickly. I was knocked over, thing bony hands pinning me down to the ground. The mask flipped up so fast I never saw what was underneath. Sharp teeth grabbed a hold of my jacket and started to shake it, tearing the fabric, but not reaching my skin. The attack didn't last very long. I was fully ready to accept my death in that moment. After all, I had nothing waiting for me outside of that forest. If I could become food, at least my death would mean something. But this creature didn't even give me that. It stopped, releasing my coat, and staggered back. Collapsing on its side, it let out ragged wheezing breaths. It used up all its strength in that thin body. I watched it, wondering what to do next. I grabbed a blanket from my tent, trying to wrap it up to keep the creature warm. It weakly pushed my hands away, sharp claws catching my coat, but not tearing it. Wrapping the thing very much like a burrito, I went about getting it back inside the tent. I couldn't see the creature's expression, but I could sense how annoyed my new campmate was being manhandled and wrapped up. Until it regained some strength, it would need to accept some help. I went back outside, wrapped myself in my own blanket again, and stared back into the weak fire. I planned on staying up all night, but I drifted between sleep until dawn came. Out in the trees I heard sounds. As if someone was walking around in the dark just beyond my camp. Fear fluttered in my stomach. I was out in the open, exhausted from the cold weather. I didn't mind death. but I was still afraid of whatever was stalking around in the night. When morning arrived, I looked around the camp to find someone, or something had in fact been circling my camp. Muddy tracks and broken twigs gave me enough evidence of being watched. I wondered if it was more of those creatures waiting to grab the injured on inside the tent. At least I lived through one night so far. My new guest was out of the tent when I got back to camp. It wrapped in a blanket glaring at me from under the mask. I could feel the eyes on me, even if I couldn't see them. I needed to think of what to do next. I could just pack up and leave. I doubted these things would follow me into the city. It still wasn't healed up and wouldn't be able to protect itself if whoever hung it up came back, trying to get the creature to eat. It had no interest in the hot dogs and marshmallows I brought. It was a little surreal seeing a lanky creature like it in the dim gray morning light. This thing wasn't human, and yet I was helping it for reasons I didn't know. Aside from people, this thing might eat other meat. If I could shoot some game, maybe a good meal would help it gain some strength back. And maybe for all my trouble I would be eaten in the end. Only time would tell how thankful this thing would be for all the help. I didn't want to go off into the forest hunting alone. If another person came across my camp, I didn't want them to come across my monster. One of them would end up dead if that happened. I paced trying to think of what to do. As if it could sense my train of thought, the lanky creature bundled the blanket, putting it inside the tent to stay dry. Then, it climbed up my back, lanky limbs wrapping around me. My skin crawled and stood, back bent trying to support the sudden weight change. I waited for the attack that never came. We just awkwardly stood there waiting on each other to do something. I could go hunting if I carried the creature on my back. It would take longer than normal, but could be done. Picking up my rifle and small pack, I started off into the trees, still really creeped out by the thing that I decided to help. At least it wasn't trying to eat me. I really needed to call the creature on my back something. Naming things was difficult. I went through at least 100, while sneaking through the woods, trying to pick up on any game tracks. I didn't know what it was beside not human. Skinwalker and Wendigo just didn't suit what it was from what I've heard about them. No legends or cryptid name felt right. Soon I found myself not caring if I had the name of its species. I doubted humans even came across them often enough to give it a name. I was startled out of my thoughts when I came right up on a deer. A decent-sized buck that should have run before I even got this close. Holding my breath, I froze, hand on my rifle. Careful to make as little noise as possible, I raised my weapon to get my shot lined up. For a moment I wondered what I was doing was even right. This thing I was taking care of could be evil. The missing person cases was a hint towards that. Then again, it might just be a part of nature. Killing a deer to feed the creature wouldn't be wrong, if this is what happened in the woods without me interfering. I shot twice for good measure. The buck fell with a grunt of surprise. The thing on my back dropped to the ground moving like liquid. It sulked towards the falling creature, masked face darting around, as if it expected something was going to swoop in and take its food. While watching it eat, I decided on a name in the worst way possible. I've seen videos of what a fox sounds like. Those nightmare screeches and sounds were the same kind this creature made while it tore into the deer and ate. Because its back was turned to me, I never saw its face. Just the fact the mask was lifted so it could bite and tear off chunks of flesh. Fox felt like a suitable name for the monster I'd taken in. Fox, I said mostly to myself, trying the name out. The creature slightly turned at my voice, letting me see a human-looking mouth, but filled with bloody sharp teeth. I think he liked the name. Fox ate through the entire deer with insane speed. Even after devouring through pounds of meat, he was still skinny enough for me to see his rib cage. It was a mystery where he put it all. Gathering up the larger bones, he followed behind me back to the camp. At least he could walk now, although limping and trailing behind. He crawling mostly on all fours even though he was holding bones in his hands. I led him to the river first so he could get cleaned up in the cold water, and I refilled some of my bottles to boil later. When we arrived back at camp, Fox gnawed on a rib while reluctantly letting me look at his injured ankle. It healed so much I knew he would be fine by tonight or tomorrow. Watching him chew, though his bone stash, I wondered yet again what I was doing. Not only did I not leave him to die, I'd named him. There was something seriously wrong with me if I could get attached to a creature like this. "You can eat me, you know," I told him, not knowing if he knew what I was saying. Fox looked over at my voice but didn't pause in his gnawing, bone under his moss blanket covering his face. Strangely enough, I wasn't scared of him. I'd already accepted my death for a while now. If he wanted to eat me next, I would almost welcome it. The rest of the day I let him wander around camp, and I kept the fire going and took a few short naps to catch up on sleep. When night fell, the fear of death finally came to me. I was inside the tent while Fox stayed beside the fire. I'd heard noises from outside and carefully crawled out from my sleeping bag to try and see the source. It sounded like a few people walking just outside where the firelight could reach. Fox tensed up, looking ready to attack if needed. I found my rifle, taking it into my hand as silently as I could. My eyes adjusted to the darkness and I could faintly see forms similar to Fox moving around in the trees. There was more of whatever he was in this forest. I stood waiting for them to make a move, rifle pointing downward. I didn't want to shoot one if they only showed up to pick up a missing member of their pack. One was brave enough to poke its head into the light. It was low to the ground, lanky elbows pointing up. It also had a blank wooden mask, but it had a mane of tangles branches covering the upper half of its body. For a second, I thought I spotted glowing eyes inside that heap of wood staring daggers at me. "Well, go on," I whispered to Fox, trying to encourage him to go and rejoin his group. Almost like cats, they got closer to each other on all fours, backs arched, studying and doing a half circle around each other. Other creatures appeared, watching the exchange, each having a mask of wood with some sort of pile of forest debris covering their faces. Some stood on two legs, making them almost 8 feet tall, other on all four, ready to swiftly run forward if startled. It looked like it was going well. Fox got closer to the other creature and reached a clawed hand over as a gesture I didn't understand. In a blink of an eye, they both flew into a flurry of motion. Horrible hissing and garbling cries came from the tangled pair, thrashing, trying to kill each other. My heart sank, and a pit of black fear opened up my stomach. Fox healed up a bit since he was with me, but he wasn't strong enough to fight off the newcomer, let alone all the ones in the woods watching. I accepted I would die, but I was not able to let Fox die with me. I lifted my rifle and aimed it away from the fight. I fired it off into the woods, aiming at nothing. I hoped the sound would make them stop, and it worked. The one creature stopped to look around for the sound. Fox kicked the other aside and scrambled to me as I ran over and stood between him and the other pale form. The newcomer was covered in scratches, dripping in blood. Fox looked worse. His arm broken, and countless cuts on his thin body from the brief fight. Getting between them, I received a fast long cut to my arm, but it was nothing compared to what Fox went through. I pointed the rifle towards the monster on all fours, ready to fire if needed. It stared at me from behind that faceless mask. The other creatures didn't move. I heard Fox shuffling around behind me, but I didn't turn to see what he was doing. When the other creature turned its head away from me to watch Fox, I finally did the same. He'd taken off the faceless wooden mask from his hood of moss and tossed it into the fire in front of all of us. The wood gave off a high-pitched shrieking sound as if it was an animal dying. Black flames shot up, spewing into the sky for a few seconds until the noise died down. The mask was burned up completely. Fox sat next to the fire, nursing his bad arm. Slowly the creatures around us started to leave one by one, until the one that attacked Fox remained. It sat, blood dripping from its wounds. Finally, it too turned and left us. My arm bleeding and rifle feeling heavy. Dropping my weapon, I collapsed to my knees. Caring about someone else was beyond stressful. White-hot pain started to come through my body from my cut. I found my arm was too heavy to move to see how deep the wound was. Trying to stand, my legs suddenly refused to work. Not knowing why, I fainted into a deep sleep I didn't awake from until it was morning. When I opened my eyes, I was inside my tent on my side. My arm out front of me so I could see the wound was stuffed with moss. I felt hot and too weak to move or do anything at all. I couldn't even move my fingers. Pain came in waves as I tried to ignore it. Focusing on anything but the throbbing in my arm, I listened to the pattering of rain outside. The light was gray and impossible to tell what time it was. The tent flap open, letting cool air and misty rain come inside the tent. Fox must have been the one to put me in here, but he didn't know how zippers worked. My energy fading, I fell asleep again. The next few days I knew I was dying. Whatever got into my cut was nasty. That creature easily being able to kill with one strike of its claws. I slept most of the time, far too weak and feverish to move. Fox would keep me hydrated by lifting my head to let me drink from my steel water bottle I brought along. But the water tasted muddy. He was getting it from the river, not knowing to boil it. His efforts might just kill me faster. In my fevered dreams I was tormented by the truth that haunted my every waking hour. The reason why I wanted death so badly, even though I was too much of a coward to do it myself. I wasn't there to hear the car accident, but was still plagued by the sounds. My mind repeated the sound of the officer knocking on my door at 4 in the morning to awkwardly tell me the news. His first time saying such tragic words to another person. And I knew it was all my fault. 5 years ago, I cheated on my wife. A one-night fling. I did not have a good reason aside from I just felt like it. I told her knowing I would be unable to hide it. She very understandably got upset and left the house to her brother's place 4 blocks away. They both drank and insulted me. Something I rightfully deserved. To this day, I don't know why they decided to drive back home that night. She was too drunk to drive, but her brother thought he was fine. It was only 4 blocks away from our home, and yet they got into a 3-car pileup from people leaving the bar for the night. Everyone in my wife's car died that night. Everyone else in the other cars were lucky enough to receive injuries they could recover from. 3 people died. My wife, her brother and our daughter in the backseat of the car. I went to sleep when she left and wasn't even aware she took our daughter to her brother's place with her. All because I made one decision to go home with a woman I thought was attractive. A whim killed 3 people. I needed to live with that fact for the rest of my life. Delirious from the fever, I could barely keep my eyes open. I saw Fox sitting next to me, his form blurry in my weak state. I couldn't handle falling back asleep and hearing my daughter was gone again. Please, kill me. I begged him in a voice barely above a whisper. He didn't react for a long time. The longer I looked, the more I noticed he was slightly different. More human. His proportions not as lanky as before. He leaned in, and I saw instead of the moss covering his face he replaced it with torn up fabric that was once my clothing. He didn't keep it together with glue or thread. My tired brain wondered how the heaps of cloth stayed on his head. Reaching over he took my arm, now red and infected from the cut. It caused a jolt of pain that almost knocked me out again to rattle my bones. Lifting my hand to his covered face, Fox lifted some of the rags to reveal a mouth of sharp teeth. Without any hesitation he took my pinky finger off in one bite. I let out a soft scream, struggling to stay awake. Letting my hand drop, his long fingers came into view, moving directly to my throat. Darkness overtook me. I died. Fox choked the life out of me. Then, he gave some back. It's something beyond anything I could ever understand of how it happened. And I don't think I ever need to fully understand it. I woke up, scar on my arm, feeling better than I had in years. Aside from being stiff, my illness left me. I was still inside my tent, rain softly hitting against the outside. Looking to my side, a bundle of blankets was taking up most of the space. Peeking under them, Fox was curled up. He moved from his nest being disturbed but didn't wake up. I left him alone, climbing out of the tent trying to get the kinks out of my back. It was still damp, but I was glad to be in the cool air outside. A few minutes passed after I came out and I took stock of everything. My pinky was still gone, but wound healed along with the cut on my arm. Aside from my clothing being torn apart by Fox, nothing else touched the camp while I was out of commission. I was wondering what I should do when crunching of twigs drew my attention. The pair of men stood wearing raincoats over wet gear, both with rifles over their shoulders, unable to keep them dry. I thought I saw some chain poking out from one of their overpacked bags. Each seemed as if they were camping for a long time and worn down to the bone. "Can I help you with anything?" I asked the pair, voice cracking from a dry throat. I knew who they were. Without a doubt they trapped Fox and left him hung up in a tree to die. I wondered if I was going to run into the people who did such a thing and still didn't know how to react when it happened. Have you seen anything strange at night? One asked slowly while looking over my camp. I felt my hands start to shake and forced myself to keep them steady. Nope. Nothing. Terrible weather, don't you think? I'm going to pack up and leave today. I hoped I sounded casual enough. Glancing over, I saw Fox sitting up in the tent moving around in the blanket pile silently. From the angle only I was the one who could see him. The two men looked at each other as if trying to decide something. If Fox saw them, would he kill them? Would I let him after what they did? If we let them go back into the forest, these two would kill more of those creatures. I was sure of that. Whatever was in the woods, they hunted them down. And I found that I didn't care. I didn't save Fox because of what he is. I saved him to give myself a reason to keep going. He was special because I'd named him and made him special. They hurt him before he became that. If they left, I wouldn't go after them. But if they dared trying to harm Fox now, I wouldn't hesitate in killing them. Either they were too tired to deal with me, or I looked natural enough for them to believe my lie. Alright, take care of yourself, the older one said with a small wave of his hand. I watched as they left, still holding my breath. Fox poked out his head covered in rags directed towards the men who was already gone. Still not too late to go after them. Fox gave them no notice. Do you want to go home? I asked him, not even sure if he could understand me. When I left the woods, I took something with me. A creature that almost looks human now. I sold my house and bought a very small cabin by the lake. I figured it would be better suited for Fox being around woods. He's never spoken to me and I've never seen what face he hides. There is still so much I don't know about the monster I carried out of those woods. The only thing I do know about him is he's now my reason to keep living. I never needed a good one, I just needed something.